Are you ready?
Yeah.
Yes!
This is the Ross Kaminsky Show.
You're a great American.
Now, Ross Kaminsky.
Come on, man.
On Denver's talk station, 630 KHOW.
All right, good morning. I'm Ross. Thanks for being here. Apparently, according to DJ Shannon, we are up live on YouTube right now. If you go to youtube.com and type in Ross Kaminsky, you will hopefully find me. If you see me with a blue shirt, then you got the right video. Yes, and shaved. I shaved. Yes, I used one of those. I don't use the actual razor all that often. When I do, I grab my Harry's razor and use it. But I like the electric clipper in part because this is the thing. When I use the electric clipper to shave, then I end up still with some 5 o'clock shadow kind of thing. And then it makes everybody think that I grow a beard at an astonishingly fast rate. And I don't know why exactly that I enjoy having people think that. And I always tell them it's not true when they mention something like it. But it is just kind of fun to think, well, Ross shaved yesterday and he's already got what for normal people would be 4 days growth of beard. So I just let it go. Yesterday was the first day, as we talked a little bit about on the show yesterday. Yesterday was the first day of the second impeachment trial of former President now, Donald Trump. And the question yesterday was a simple one. The arguments back and forth between the House managers and Trump's defense team was a question of whether this trial is constitutional and whether it should be allowed to proceed. And putting aside for a moment any of my own personal views on that question, if you listened to or watched the proceedings yesterday afternoon, I don't think you would ever have seen such a massive gap between well-prepared, competent lawyering and unprepared, incompetent lawyering as you got between the House managers, who were the competent ones, the Democrats, and Trump's legal team, who were, I don't know, incompetent sounds harsh, but if you were going to just grade them based on what they did yesterday, you'd have to say some combination of incompetent and unprepared. And I'm going to give you a sense of that with some audio here in a moment. I will just say, before proceeding, in the defense, a little bit, of President Trump's legal team, they have a fairly difficult client, and they have a fairly difficult case to defend, but not that difficult. Lots of other lawyers have gotten clients acquitted that were in worse positions than President Trump is from a legal or even political legal point of view. This was just some bad lawyering, but President Trump fired, or his previous legal team quit, about a week before this. It was reported, I haven't heard any of the lawyers actually say it, but it was reported that part of the reason that Trump and his prior legal team decided not to work with each other anymore just before the trial was that the president kept insisting that his lawyers use as a defense in the trial that the election was stolen, and by which he means fraudulent votes and machine switching votes and things like that that either didn't happen at all or didn't happen at a scale big enough to impact the election. There's lots of stuff to talk about with the election. Lots of stuff that was bad that happened, like the way Pennsylvania changed their voting rules. The court changed their voting rules. They shouldn't have been allowed to, but that's a whole different thing from most of the election is stolen arguments, and the lawyers wouldn't make those arguments. And so they left, and Trump had to bring in these other guys. And I presume that these other guys are probably good lawyers in their own right, but they sure didn't show it yesterday. And I would also note that when it comes to this question of, is the trial constitutional? There have been some very smart conservative lawyers. Michael Ludwig wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal recently. John Yoo was talking about this. Andy McCarthy talked about doing a podcast with John Yoo about it. John Yoo, former, was he? I don't think he was Solicitor General, but he was a key player in the Bush administration, and generally a guy who finds expansive executive branch powers when asked such questions. And these are very smart conservative lawyers who've made arguments as to why the trial is unconstitutional. So all that Trump's lawyers really needed to do was go read the arguments of smart people who have said that the trial is unconstitutional and reword those arguments, put them in their own words, maybe cite the other lawyers if they want. You know, former federal judge J. Michael Ludwig said, and then quote some of that and then talk about it in their own words. There were plenty of places to go. Just in the last week, there were plenty of places to go to get good arguments as to why the trial is unconstitutional. For the record, I believe those arguments are wrong, and I believe the trial is constitutional. But that's not the point. The point is these guys were up there to do a job and make that argument. They were so bad, on the one hand, that one Republican senator who a couple of weeks ago voted that the trial was unconstitutional when Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky forced to vote on this issue. One Republican senator, his name is Bill Cassidy, he's a medical doctor from Louisiana. He switched yesterday and voted that the trial is constitutional, which is not the same as saying that he's going to vote to convict Trump. Just simply voted that the trial is constitutional. I would also, and that just peeling off even one Republican senator is a remarkable feat. Republican senators in general, politicians in general, do not like to show that they've changed their minds on something because they'll be called a flip-flopper, even though a rational person would have done what they did, which is to say, when more information comes in and you learn more, you at least have the possibility of changing your mind. Because it's also possible that more information could reinforce the view you already had. The fact that 44 Republican senators yesterday stuck with the argument that the trial is unconstitutional, even though the House managers yesterday, I think, definitively proved that it is constitutional, shows that politics is trumping truth here, and also in a more important and purely political sense, with a Republican senator voting that the trial is unconstitutional, it makes it much easier for that person to vote against eventual conviction, no matter what the evidence says. And for the record, I think if the charge is incitement of insurrection, I think that would be a very difficult charge to get a conviction on anyway. I've talked about this before. The House brought the wrong charge. They should have charged former President Trump with dereliction of duty, something along those lines. And then they would have had a much stronger argument. Now, let me just give you a sense of what this was like yesterday. See if I can find this video here. And the lead impeachment manager for the Democrats, a guy named Jamie Raskin from Maryland. His son, 25-year-old son, Harvard Law student, killed himself on New Year's Eve, had been suffering with depression for many years. And that story ended up making an appearance in Raskin's presentation yesterday. And, you know, in a way that makes the whole thing even more emotional. In a way I kind of felt like, that's a little bit cheap, even though I feel so sad for his family to bring that into the impeachment discussion. Nevertheless, that's what happened. And I'm trying here to get this video working, but it doesn't seem to want to work for me. So, Shannon, I wonder if you can do this in there. I wonder if it'll work any better for you. I'm going to try one more time. Here, let's try this.
By the U.S. House of Representatives.
Okay, so let me just pause this here. What if yesterday the House managers played a video, something like a 13-minute video, and of course this video is designed to make the events of January 6th look as aggressive and angry and violent and brutal as possible, and to tie the basis of it to President Trump as much as possible. These are the prosecutors. That's what they do. But for anybody who was watching the news that day on January 6th, you don't really need a much more distilled, a much more intensified replay of what happened to already realize how intense it was. And I was talking about this on Twitter yesterday, and some people said, well, that video was put together to fit a narrative. And I'm like, yeah, it was. They're the prosecutors. But the narrative is obviously true. The narrative of what happened that day. I'm not saying that the narrative is obviously true, that Trump intentionally incited it that day. I think you can't argue that, though. But the fact that so much of it was pre-planned makes incitement so difficult, almost impossible to prove. But the narrative that something terrible happened that day, of course it's a real thing. So they played the video, and the video was painful to watch. It is painful to watch. You see people coming up to Capitol policemen, big ignorant people, yelling at Capitol policemen, we're listening to President Trump, and he's your boss, and there's thousands of us, so you better get out of our way before you get hurt. There's videos of, one policeman who gets sort of caught in a door, and he's screaming in pain as the crowd is intentionally crushing him in the door. There's videos of people saying all kinds of crazy stuff about the election and politics, and there's videos of people building or standing on a platform that was built with a noose hanging from it, which they apparently meant either figuratively or literally for Vice President Mike Pence, a long-suffering Trump loyalist who was in the Capitol doing his job. So at the end of that video, Jamie Raskin says this.
The president was impeached by the U.S. House of Representatives on January 13th for doing that. You ask what a high crime and misdemeanor is under our Constitution? That's a high crime and misdemeanor. If that's not an impeachable offense, then there is no such thing.
And let me, again, I think he has a point there, but to the extent that he's talking about the incitement before the riot, that's going to be very difficult. What they should have impeached Trump for was what happened during and after the riot, when he didn't respond for a long time. Then eventually when he did, he emphasized the stolen election as much as what he calls a stolen election, as much as he emphasized wanting people to calm down. And he just failed to protect the Capitol. He failed. Again, the Democrats have brought the wrong charge, but this isn't a court of law. Let me give you just a little more of Raskin to give you a sense of how effective he was.
The transition of power is always the most dangerous moment for democracies. Every historian will tell you that. We just saw it in the most astonishing way. We lived through it. And you know what? The framers of our Constitution knew it. That's why they created a Constitution with an oath written into it that binds the president from his very first day in office until his very last day in office and every day in between. Under that Constitution and under that oath, the President of the United States is forbidden to commit high crimes and misdemeanors against the people at any point that he's in office. Indeed, that's one specific reason the impeachment, conviction, and disqualification powers exist, to protect us against presidents who try to overrun the power of the people in their elections and replace the rule of law with the rule of mobs. These powers must apply even if the president commits his offenses in his final weeks in office. In fact, that's precisely when we need them the most, because that's when elections get attacked. The Senate has the power, the sole power, to try all impeachments. All means all, and there are no exceptions to the rule. Because the Senate has jurisdiction to try all impeachments, it most certainly has jurisdiction to try this one. It's really that simple. The vast majority of constitutional scholars who've studied the question and weighed in on the proposition being advanced by the president, this January exception, heretofore unknown, agree with us. And that includes the nation's most prominent conservative legal scholars.
Overall, Jamie Raskin and a couple other Republicans who spoke yesterday, including Joe Neguse of Colorado, but especially Raskin, were very, very effective, and they compellingly made the argument that this trial is constitutional. The problem was that just after these guys spoke, the Trump defense team had their turn, and they were a disaster. They didn't actually even address the question, and I want to give you a sense of it. I don't mean to beat up on these guys, but I'm telling you, if you were watching the news yesterday, you were watching late-night television, you were watching Twitter yesterday, these guys became an instant joke. I mean, my cousin Vinny was trending on Twitter yesterday as these guys were talking because people were saying that what the Trump lawyers were doing was kind of the equivalent of the two Utes in a courtroom. So what I did just this morning before the show, I found the video of Bruce Castor, who was the Trump attorney who spoke first. And just for fun, I just jumped in at a bunch of random points just to see if he was saying anything that was relevant. Here's one random point.
You ever notice how when you're talking or you hear others talking about you when you're home in your state, they will say, you know, I talked to my senator, or I talked to somebody on the staff of my senator. It's always my senator. Why is it that we say my senator? We say that because the people you represent are proud of their senators. They absolutely feel that connection.
All right, I can't. So that was irrelevant. I'm not saying it was completely wrong, but it was completely irrelevant. And it was a big problem for President Trump yesterday. I wish they had done better. It doesn't even seem like a fair fight at this point. Hopefully they'll do better going forward just to make the whole thing, seem a little less like LeBron James versus me. But that's kind of how it felt yesterday. Oh, boy, I can't believe Republicans only lost one. We'll be back.
This is Denver's Talk Station with Ross Kaminsky now. Tom Martino at 10, 630 KHOW.